let's move on to social sciences. So what we did in the lecture or the prose fiction, I'm hoping that you've gotten the full sense of it, right? Now, I'm pretty sure you could do this in 8.5 minutes. So practice always doing one passage in a limited amount of time, 8.5 minutes, that would be perfect, okay? All right, moving on to the social sciences. Of course, social science in this case, I wouldn't say this is more difficult than the others that we looked into, but I'm just saying that we want to look at it carefully, and also we want to look at it strategy ways, right? Strategically finding where you're supposed to find it, right? Just like the one that we did in the prose fiction, remember? Like Kafka, finding it where you would prefer or where would you think you would find it, right? That kind of thing. All right, let's go to social sciences. It says, this passage is adapted from The Little Ice Age, How Climate Made History, 1300 to 1850 by Brian Fagan in 2000, right? So obviously this is about Little Ice Age, and if you have a little bit of background in that, it says that the Earth is it has been going through, and it's still going through, a sort of a climatic phase where it was cold and then it got warmer, colder, warmer, and colder, warmer. Now, there used to be like real hard age, like real ice age, where everything would freeze up and, things couldn't live any longer, or there were just, mild ice ages. Now, but the thing is, like a mainstream sciences would say, yes, there were little ice ages and whatnot, and so therefore the phase that we're going through would be, some of them would say the phase we're going through is a warming period. It's nothing to worry about, right? Global warming is just a hoax. It's like we're speeding things up. Yes, that's true, but that doesn't mean things are going to be real bad. But it is kind of bad, because if you think about it, all the civilizations in history, I'm talking about most of the civilization history, has a record, or at least a legend, or anything, or in the story, the myth, and whatever, that has to do with the deluge, right? That has to do with a big flood. There always was, and there always will be. I mean, you probably know about Noah in the Noah's Ark story. There are stories in like an Indian myth of the, like the big flood. The Norse mythology. Every one of these mythologies will have this big flood story, and many historians, many scientists are assuming that this deluge, or this, like this flood, is probably the result of ice melting. If all that was frozen would melt, right, it will cover up most stuff, right? That is one theory. And the other theory is the Earth pole shift, right? If the Earth pole would shift, like the pole shift, as in right now this is north and this is south, right? It will shift. So you will have the Antarctica as in north and Arctic as south, right? I mean, that would change a lot of, right? So, but I don't know what it is, exactly what happened, because we can't really find, sufficient evidence, or maybe, there is still, argument between the mainstream and the, minor or minor, one of the scientists who work on these crazy ideas. But anyways, right? Either way, we're talking about little ice age and how that ice age, how climatic changes made history, all right? So keep that in mind, and let's go to the first paragraph of the first sentence and the last sentence. The first sentence says, speak the words ice age, and the mind turns to the Cro-Magnon or Cro-Magnon mammoth hunters on windswept European plains, devoid of trees. So that's what we think of when we say ice age. We think of Cro-Magnons, those early people, early Homo, before the Homo sapiens, that's before the Homo sapiens, after the Homo erectus, somewhere there, right? Cro-Magnons. European, devoid of the tree. So that's what we think of when we say ice age, right? And then in the last sentence of the paragraph says, the Little Ice Age was an endless zigzag of climatic shifts, few lasting more than a quarter century. Today's prolonged warming is an anomaly. All right, so we're saying today's prolonged warming is an anomaly, as in the warming that we are experiencing right now is an anomaly, because back then, when there was a little ice age, there was a shift every quarter century. So quarter century would every 25 years. every 25 years there were climatic changes, like major climatic changes, as in, like it was cold, it was hot, cold and hot, cold and hot, blah, 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 blah. So we're talking about actual ice age, right? And we're saying that today's prolonged warming is an anomaly. So that's also important. The second paragraph, quite long. Reconstructing the climatic changes of the past is extremely difficult because reliable instrument records are but a few centuries old, right? There is just not enough data or not correct data to reconstruct the climatic changes, right? Because back then, thousands of years ago, people did not exactly know how to record the climate of the time, right? So therefore, that's the idea. So probably the rest of it will talk about how it was difficult to gather these data. The third paragraph, a generation ago, we had a generalized impression of Little Ice Age climate compiled with painstaking care from a bewildering array of historical sources and a handful of tree ring sequences. You know what a tree ring sequence is, right? Tree rings are things that you find in the trees, right? And this will tell you the age of the tree. So that's what we're talking about. So tree ring sequences, a handful of tree ring sequences, and the array of historical data, bewildering array of historical sources. That was it for the Little Ice Age. So that's what we're talking about, right? And this will continue to talk about that. And the next one, to what extent did these or those climatic shifts alter the course of European history? Now, finally, we're getting into our main idea of how it shaped and formed the Western history, especially the Western European history, or at least the European history, the climatic shifts, right? And we'll talk about how it was and what was the impact of that. And then the last, I think, would be consider, for instance, the food crisis that engulfed Europe during the Little Ice Age, the Great Hunger of 1315 to 1319, the food dearths of 1741, and 1816, the year without a summer, right? To mention only a few. So we're talking about the actual events that happened, right? Consider, for instance, the food crisis, right? These are the events that happened because of the climatic changes. I'm not exactly sure 1315 to 1315 what happened. I'm not so sure about this as well, but I think it was like the food crisis, as in because it was too cold, the crops wouldn't grow well or properly, so you wouldn't have anything. So I think it's probably to the same sort of a year. And then 1816, if there's no summer, right, there's no growth of any kind of crop, not any kind of crop, but there's no growth of the crops, and so therefore it'd be difficult, right? Okay, so that's the entire idea. Now you understand, right? I mean, we only read like the very, very little portions of it, but we know that this paragraph is talking about the Ice Age as a whole and generalizing the Ice Age. This paragraph talks about how hard or difficult it is to reconstruct the climatic models or climatic changes of the past because of the lack of data. And this will talk about that lack of data, as in we only have this much to go on. And then we'll talk about then how did it affect the European history. To give an example, that's it, right? Simple as that. Moving on to the question, number 11, right? Number 11, the author most nearly characterizes the role of climate change in the course of history as one that what? So we need to know what kind of role did climatic change play in the course of history? Is it neither all important nor safely disregarded? Is rightly ignored by archaeologists and scientists, was greater in medieval Europe than it is today, or will eventually be seen as direct and causative? So what is it, right? Climatic changes. How does the author characterize the role of climatic change? So will eventually be seen as direct and causative? I don't think so, because we're looking at what? We're looking at the trend, right? Remember, it's all about the trend, whether it gets hot, whether it gets cold, hot and cold. So it's a trend, not that the climate changes in the course of history, as in it will be seen as direct and causative. No, it's just one of those things that happen. It's a trend, but it doesn't really. If you want to make sure that that's the idea here, many archaeologists and historians are suspicious of the role of climate change in changing human societies, and with good reasons, right? So climate changes don't really affect people. And it says environmental determinism, the notion that climate change was the primary cause of the major developments like say agriculture, has been a dirty word in academia for generations. So people don't believe that it's the environmental determinism, right? So therefore, definitely not. Was it greater in medieval Europe than it is today? I don't think so. It's the same. It's rightly ignored by archaeologists and scientists. It is rightly ignored by them, but they don't totally dismiss it, right? For example, they don't. They say it is, yes, but you certainly cannot argue that climate drove history in direct and causative way to the point of toppling governments, nor, however, can you contend that climate change is something that you can totally ignore, right? So they're saying that, yeah, it didn't really change anything, like it didn't affect the, like the toppling of the governments in Western Europe, but you can also say that the climate change is something that you can totally ignore. So meaning you cannot totally ignore it, you still need to use it, right? So here it says, rightly ignored by archaeologists and scientists, no. So what we can say is it's neither all important, right? So meaning it's a little bit important, nor safely disregarded, but we can't really regard it, right? Or disregard it. So we're saying it is little bit of important, it has little bit of importance, it cannot be ignored, right? So that's what A is supposed to say. So your answer will have to be A, right? So this was kind of difficult to understand if you're not a native speaker of English, right? This will be a little bit difficult because it's neither all important nor safely disregarded. Some people just mistake this, especially foreign students mistake this for, like other meanings. They would say, oh, okay, so they're saying it's all important, it's safely disregarded. They would say, no, that's not the answer. But in truth, it says neither, it means not, right? It is not all important, nor safely so, right? I mean, natively speaking, that should be easy, but for people who are foreign descent, it would be a little bit difficult, right? But try working on that, right? But none of these would make sense. So I'm pretty sure you'll be confused with A and B as one of the answers. But B, remember, it's not total ignorance of the climate change, but you can't really ignore it, right? It doesn't really have too important, or it's not really too important, but it cannot be ignored. Okay, that's the idea. All right, moving on to number 12. The main idea of the first paragraph is that Little Ice Age. So we know the main idea of the first paragraph, right? We know that Little Ice Age, generally speaking, is that. So, was a period defined by a prolonged global cooling. It occurred during the era of Cro-Magnon mammoth hunters. Was marked by a frequent and short-term climate shift, resulted from the interaction between the atmosphere and ocean. You can find the answer right away, right? Why is this an answer? Why? Because we know that, so that's the answer. We know that in the last sentence of the first paragraph, we know that Little Ice Age was an endless zigzag of climatic shifts, few lasting more than a quarter century, right? So definitely the answer will have to be was marked by frequent and short-term climate shifts, right? That's the only answer you can get. So I mean, as easy as it sounds, right? I mean, it is as easy as it sounds. You can find the answer right away at the last sentence of the first paragraph, and that's what I'm talking about when we say read the first, last, and first sentences of every paragraph, because that's where mostly your answers will be located. All right, moving on to number 13. Easy, right? The author uses the remark, the worst rainstorm in memory, in line 28 primarily as an example of. Now this one we haven't read, so we'll probably have to read this, line 28, right? So line 28, somewhere there, so we'll read from line 20, say 4. Okay, remember, it's always prudent for you to read a little bit further ahead, right? So chronicles, like those of the 18th century diarist, John Evelyn, or monastery scribes, are invaluable for their remarks on unusual weather, but their usefulness in making comparisons is limited. So remarks like the worst rainstorm in memory, or hundreds of fishing boats overwhelmed by mighty waves, do not give you an accurate meteorological record. It's not a meteorological record even if they made a deep impression at the time, right? So you can't say it's very subjective. Say, oh, it was the biggest rain. It was like the worst rainstorm in memory. It doesn't mean that it was like a huge it was like a huge rainstorm. There could have been worse. I mean, that's why we classify them now, right, into category 1, 2, and 3, and 4. I think there's a 5, right? Hurricanes. I think the category 1 to 5 hurricanes, or I think there's like for certain countries there's like levels of 1, 2, and 3 for storms and thunderstorms and whatnot, right? So therefore that's what it means. So what does that necessarily mean then, right? So what's the idea behind that? So what does that remark, the worst rainstorm in memory, mean? Is it the kind of well-meaning but ultimately useless records of unusual weather that Evelyn kept? how people in the 18th century were deeply impressed by unusual weather? Or is it C, is it people's preoccupation with carefully rating and comparing unusual weather events? Or is it how notes people in the past kept about unusual weather are of limited meteorological value today? It gives you the answer right away. It's how notes people in the past kept about unusual weather are limited meteorological value today, right? Because it's very subjective, because you can't say it's the worst in memory, it doesn't really mean anything, so the answer will have to be B, right? Simple as that, right? It was very simple up to number 13. I'm hoping that you could have solved this within, within say a minute time, because all of these questions, number 1 to 13, should have taken you less than, say, 20 seconds each. I'd have to say 20 seconds each, right? It was really easy to solve, so let's move on. 14. The author indicates that the common factor in the events and periods listed in lines 50 and 54. So common factors, you need to find the common factors in the events and periods, right? In lines 50 and 54. Obviously, we haven't read that because we don't remember that. So let's go to 50 and 54 and try to find that, right? So 50 and 54, somewhere down here. So remember, this paragraph talks about that handful of historical records or resources and also the tree ring sequences that we had, right? So we'll read a little bit down. And so we'll read from here, okay? How long ever it will take, we'll read from there. So we can now track the Little Ice Age as an intricate tapestry of short-term climatic shifts that ripple through European society during times of remarkable change. Centuries that saw Europe emerge from medieval fiefdom and pass by stages through the Renaissance, the Age of Discovery, the Enlightenment, the French and the Industrial Revolutions, and the making of modern Europe, right? So I guess what they're saying is now we can track the Little Ice Age and what their effects were to the stages through the Renaissance, the Age of Discovery or the Enlightenment, and the French and the Industrial Revolutions, and the making of modern Europe. So what are these events supposed to be, or the common factors of these events, right? Common factor in the events and periods listed in 50 and 54 is that they took place during the Little Ice Age, or were the result of the Ice Age, or were unaffected by the Ice Age, or occurred after the Little Ice Age. So what would it be? It's either F or G, right? So well, which one of it? Remember, we're not really saying that it was the result of the Little Ice Age, right? We're not really saying that because we read that previously, that yes, they do hold some kind of an importance, right? Right? Some kind. We're not saying that that's the total cause of it or the sole cause of it, right? We're not saying that it's the sole cause of the changes in European history. We're not saying that, right? We're just saying it's part of it, or maybe, a very, say, a significant part of it, not the sole result of it. So we're not saying it's the result of the Little Ice Age, but we're just saying that it happened during the Little Ice Age. You just read that there as well. You just read that there in lines 50. You just read that it says we can now track the Little Ice Age, right, as intricate tapestry of the short-term climatic shifts that ripple through European society during the times of these remarkable changes, such as the Renaissance, the Age of Discovery, the Enlightenment, the French and the Industrial Revolution, and the making of the modern Europe, right? So therefore, the answer will have to be took place during the Little Ice Age, right? Simple as that. Yes? Moving on to number 15 now. Now, by his statement in line 71 and 75, I mean author, I guess, the author most nearly means that during the Little Ice Age, what happened, right? 71 and 75, lines 71 and 75. Let's go back because I doubt that we have read that, 71 to 75. So 71 to 75 is located down here somewhere, but we know what this was talking about. We know then to what extent did it actually affect the European history. So we'll read from right there because 71 to 75, but we want to read, we want to be prudent and read a little bit further. It says, their survival depended on crop yields, cycles of good and poor harvests, of cooler and wetter spring weather, and could make a crucial difference between hunger and plenty, life and death. And the sufficiency or insufficiency of food was a powerful motivator of human actions, and sometimes on a national or even continent-wide scale, with consequences that could take decades to unfold, right? So that's what we're talking about. So their most important effect of the climatic changes, therefore, or thereof, was the actual crop yield, right? That would affect the crop yield because crop yield would definitely affect everything else. So that's what we're talking about in lines numbers 71 75. So what are we saying? Most nearly meaning that a food or a lack of thereof could have far-reaching and long-lasting effects. That's obviously what we're talking about. The difference between the hunger and plenty was a very small one, right? Not really. The food shortages were relatively rare at the national continent. Not really. The insufficiency of food motivated peasant farmers to work harder. Not really, right? We're not talking about any one of these. So obviously we're talking about this far-reaching and lasting effect of the food or lack of food or food thereof, right? So the answer will have to be A. Remember, crop yields is very important. Crop yield. If you had more food or less food, I mean, that was a long time ago. That was the sole reason why one country would invade the other country, because they simply did not have enough food, right? I mean, that could change the entire history of the civilization as well. So that's the idea, right? Okay, good. Remember that. 15. Next. 16. The author uses the events listed in line 77 and 79 primarily too. Now, we obviously have read that, if you remember. 72, 77, 79 was the food shortages of 1315 to 1319, 1871, and so on and on and on. There were all these events, right? That's something that we read. If you want to check it, let's go back. 77 and 79. Right? We read that. 77 to 79 right there. So for instance, the food crisis that engulfed Europe during the Little Ice Age, the Great Hunger of 1315, 1319, 1741, 1816, I'm sorry, it was 1816, the year without a summer, right? So if that's the idea, then what can we say? What can we say? Primarily to do what? Show how weather-related disasters threaten the survival of Western civilization? Or is it to criticize subsistence-level agriculture as being too dependent on the weather? Or illustrate how environmental determinism operated in the Little Ice Age? Or suggest that the part that climate shifts may have had in producing modern Europe, right? So we're talking about probably this, right? Suggests that the part that the climate shifts, like the hunger of 1315 to 1319, 17 whatever, and 1816 or 15, may have had in producing modern Europe. Why is that? Because if you read it further, right, there's further reading required if you want to really do it. Mention only a few. These crises themselves did not threaten the continued existence of Western civilization, but they surely played an important role in the formation of modern Europe. It says so right there, right? So that's the answer, right? So it's that's the answer. Suggests the part that the climate shifts may have had in producing modern Europe, right? So remember, I just want to point out here is that just because they said line 70 and 70 and 77, 79, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to read only 77 and 79, because that's just what they're saying. 77 and 79 lines, the events that are mentioned there, is a result of what, or primarily to do what, right? That's why I tell you to be prudent, right? And read the sentences that come before and maybe come after as well, right? So the best thing you can do, this is a tip, right? The best thing you can do is if you locate that, if you locate that sentence, if you locate that sentence and if you locate the keyword that you're supposed to find, then what you want to do is you want to read the sentence that comes before it, right? And the actual sentence, and then the sentence that come after it. Okay, so 3 sentences. If you read the 3 sentences, then it would give you a better understanding of what you're supposed to read or what you're supposed to solve. All right, so always remember that. It's very prudent for you to do so. Now, remember, what we did on 77 and 79 was the very beginning of the paragraph, right? That was the 77 to 79. Now, if this is the case, usually they don't relate back to the previous paragraph, but rather you read down onto the next sentence of that paragraph, and it will yield you an important understanding, right? So remember that, please. Moving on. 17. The author cites all of the following as causes of the European food crisis during the Little Ice, except for this one. Now, I'm pretty sure you would be able to solve this, right? Let's try this. Is it human inaptitude? Is it bad economic policies? Or is it poor political policies? Or is it bankrupt intellectualism? Now, let's just think of it in a very logical sense, right? Do you think human inaptitude, as in humans' inability to do something, could have caused the European food crisis? I think so. Even if the climate was bad, humans were able to do something, right? But they were, out of ideas maybe. They didn't have the skills to do so. Definitely, this could be. I'm just doing this out of the passage itself. We're just thinking it, right? Bad economic policy? I think so. It's closely related with the farming itself, because remember, farming was the major industry at the time, and it required a lot of money to do so. And if there were bad economic policies, I don't think they would have been able to overcome that problem, right? Is it poor political policy? Yes. If you have a poor political policy, then it would be next to impossible for you to do something about that, right? I mean, you see this a lot in many other countries. Like, for example, poor political policies in Africa is causing hunger, food shortages, right? Bad economic policies in South Asia or Southeast Asia, some countries, Southeast Asia, right? It's causing food shortages. Human inaptitude, this is Africa, this is Southeast Asia, or those people who have difficult, or the third world, they are suffering because of these three. Bankrupt intellectualism. Now, what's a bankrupt intellectualism? I guess intellectualism is your ability to think, or maybe studying or whatever. Now, bankrupting of these, or bankruptcy of these intellectualism, would that cause food crisis? Now, I would have to say, agriculture, yes, it does require, right? It does require, right? It does require some sort of a thinking, some sort of a scientific knowledge, but it's not that difficult. It's not that complicated. Think about it. It's not that complicated. It has a cycle, right? I mean, I don't know if you've studied farming. So what they do is for rice, that is, right? For rice, this is what happens in Korea for rice. They start planting it, or they start seeding it, right? So that the seeds will grow, or seeds will bud. That will be in April, right? That will be in April, and then it will grow until May, and they will start to plant the seedlings. Right now, they will plant the seedlings sometime in May, right? And then it will grow June, July, and August, right? And then they'll start harvesting it either in late September or early October, right? That's what happens. Now, this is a knowledge, of course, but this is not a knowledge learned, but this is knowledge passed down, right? I mean, if your father is a farmer, that you probably have seen what he did, and you learn from him, and you're able to do so, right? So, not necessarily intellectualism here is important. I'm not saying farmers are stupid. I'm just saying that for farmers, it's not a knowledge acquisition, but rather it's an experience that they gain, and they do whatever they have learned to do, they've seen to do, right? So therefore, the answer will have to be bankrupt intellectualism. Now, if that's not sufficing enough, right? So let's go to the Little Ice Age and European food crisis and the causes of this. You know where that is, right? The European food crisis. So maybe, there you go, right there. Read a little more. Some of these crises resulted from climatic shifts, others from human inaptitude, or disastrous economic and political policy. Many from a combination of all three. Environmental determination may be, right, intellectually bankrupt, but climate change is the ignored player on the historical stage, right? It says intellectual bankruptcy, or bankrupt intellectually, but that is to say that it is the environmental determinism, which stated in the previous sentences here, environmental determinism is the notion that climate change was the primary cause of the major development. Not true. That's what we're saying. Intellectually bankrupt, but climatic change is the ignored player on the historical stage, right? So the answer will have to be, we found that it was the bankrupt intellectualism, right? Okay. I mean, logically speaking, those are your not answers, right? That should be your answer. All right, moving on, number 18. The author calls for interactions that produce the Little Ice Age climate shifts, right? The author calls interactions that produce the Little Ice Age climatic shifts as what, right? As powerful and relatively straightforward, or is it complex and yet not well understood, or is it frequent and not often studied today, or intricate and generally beneficial to humans? Which one of these does he say of the interactions that produce the Little Ice Age, right? Interactions that produce the Little Ice Age, we need to find that. So the keyword would be interactions that produce Little Ice Age, right? Obviously this will not be here, right? Obviously not here, because we're talking about climatic changes actually, right? The things that happen. So maybe we'll talk about it in somewhere here, right? Well, let's say somewhere here. All right, so let's say, but the Little Ice Age was from a deep freeze. Think instead of an irregular seesaw of rapid climatic shifts driven by complex and still little understood interactions, there you go, We found it right away, right? Interaction. So here we go. Was far from a deep freeze. Think instead of an irregular seesaw of rapid climatic shifts driven by complex and still little understood interactions between the atmosphere and ocean. So therefore it is complex and still little understood, right? Complex and little understood. That should be your keywords. Complex and little understood. So is it powerful and relatively straightforward? Complex and not well understood? Frequent and not often studied today? Intricate and generally beneficial to humans? The answer, of course, will have to be, right? You read that part, right? So remember, we were trying to find the interactions that produce the Little Ice Age. But remember, what did we say about the first paragraph? The general facts about, right? The general facts about Little Ice Age. Second paragraph talks about what? Second paragraph, we're talking about the actual data lacking, right? There were no data. And then it says the only data that they had was this. And then there was that changes made in Europe, right? Because of that. So you follow this and you will definitely find that the interactions, or at least Little Ice Age, regarding Little Ice Age, should be right there. And we obviously found that interaction there, and it was complex and not well understood, right? Okay. Simple as that, right? I'm hoping that you're getting this. 19. Which of the following is not listed in the passage as an element of the Little Ice Age? Now remember, we talked about this quite a lot, right? The first paragraph was generalized ideas or generalization of what the Little Ice Age is, and the second one and the third one and the fourth one did have its own right? So meaning that if they're talking about passage as an element of the Little Ice Age, right? Element of the Little Ice Age, and what makes a Little Ice Age, definitely we find it in the generalization of that Little Ice Age. So let's see if that's true. But let's read that first, though. Read the answer choices first of all, so that we can at least glimpse at what these are supposed to be, and if we can find them within that paragraph. Heavy spring and early summer rains, intensely cold winters and easterly winds, droughts and light northeasterly winds, or mild winters and an unusually calm ocean. So let's try to find that if that's there. All right, so moving on to the very first paragraph. Here we go. All right. So we read until this far, and then let's read from the second paragraph, or the next sentence, and say, the seesaw brought cycles of intensely cold winters. So there is something that we've seen, and easterly winds, then switched abruptly to years of heavy spring and early summer rains, mild winters, and frequent Atlantic storms, or to periods of droughts, light northeasterly winds, and summer heat waves that bake growing cornfields under shimmering haze. So we get all the ideas like intensely cold winters, we have the easterly winds, heavy springs and early summer rains, and mild winters, and frequent Atlantic storms and droughts, and light northeasterly winds and summer heat waves, right? So obviously we found all the elements. All we need to do now is to compare the elements, right? So heavy spring and early summer rains, yes, that was one of the, because remember, we're finding one that was not, right? So yes, we did find that. Intensely cold winters and easterly winds, I think we found that, right? I don't remember exactly, but you have the book so you can compare that. Droughts and light northeasterly winds, I think so, right? We found that. Mild winters, yes. And an unusually calm ocean, no, I don't think so. What we found was frequent Atlantic storms, right? It says frequent Atlantic storms, not an unusually calm ocean. So obviously the answer will have to be D, right? So we found all of these except for this one, right? So therefore D should be your answer. You get the idea, right? Okay, I'm hoping that you're getting along with this. All right, the last, number 20. The author calls which of the following an anomaly? So you remember that anomaly, right? You remember the anomaly. I mean, you don't even have to go back to the passage to find the answer, because we read that in the first paragraph, the last sentence. It says the global or the unusual warming of this period is, and so therefore is it the daily weather of the Little Ice Age, today's prolonged warming, climatic seesaw of the last 100 years, or the Little Ice Age corn yields? The answer definitely, most obviously, is right, G. Yes? You didn't even have to go back, because you should know, or you should remember what you read in the first paragraph, the very first and the last sentence. So remember, this one came from that, right? And what else? What else was there? Maybe not this one. Maybe not this one. Oh, maybe not this one. It's kind of hard to find, right, all that, but this one I think was one of those, right? And this probably was one of those. This one probably was one of those, right? And this one probably one of those. If you remember, all the things that you read from the first and the last and the topic sentences will yield you these answers. And if it doesn't, then what you need to do is, because you know what each and every paragraph talks about, all you have to do is find that keyword and go back, right? Or even if you don't have to even find that keyword. For example, like the ones that we looked at, right? For example, let's say if what they want is the element, right? What they want is the element, then what you can do is you can go back to the first paragraph, because you know for sure that the first paragraph talks about the element of the Little Ice Age, because the first paragraph talks about the generalized versions or generalization of the Ice Age, right? So remember that. It's very important for you to remember these things and remember each and every paragraph that you read, right? Although you've only read the topic sentences, it will help you greatly out when you are solving these questions, okay? So remember that, please. All right, very important. So far, we've been looking into the social studies or social sciences passages, and it wasn't that difficult, right? I mean, you were able to figure it out as quick as possible. That's why we only take about 6 minutes to solve these questions, okay? So remember that. All right, so again, you've spent about 8.5 minutes and 6 minutes and about, 8 and 8 for the next two, probably humanities and natural sciences. And if you could do so, we could greatly reduce the amount of time that you spend on one passage, and you'd have more time, like 2 or 3 minutes, for you to look into the different, say, passages again and find the facts that are supposedly can reinforce your answers in many of those questions that you feel a little bit uneasy about. All right, so let's move on to the humanities, and let's continue doing this into the humanities.